Wind at ground level lies about wind 300 feet up. That's the first thing every turbine technician learns, usually the hard way, in their first season climbing. A calm afternoon on the ground can sit directly beneath a completely different atmosphere at Nacelle Height, a layer of wind sheer invisible to anyone standing on solid earth reading a handheld anemometer. I've spent 26 years learning to feel that difference before any instrument confirms it, in the specific tension of a climbing line, in the particular sound the tower makes when the wind up top is doing something the wind down here isn't. My name is Desmond Okoro. I've worked as a turbine maintenance technician and, for the last 9 years, as site safety coordinator at Meridian Ridge Wind Farm, 41 turbines spread across 11,000 acres of high plains grassland. This is a story about my wife, Adiz, who built the system that decided when a technician climbed and when they didn't, and about the afternoon that system's math was completely correct about everything except the one variable that actually mattered. Meridian Ridge installed AeroPredict 4 years ago, an AI-driven operations platform designed to optimize turbine maintenance scheduling against energy production targets, weather windows, and equipment health data across the entire farm. The system tracked lightning strike events, blade icing conditions, and component wear indicators continuously, generating climb recommendations designed to minimize downtime while keeping technicians within standard safety weather parameters. Adiz led the engineering team that built it, working her way up over 6 years from a junior operations analyst to director of predictive operations, the kind of career arc that filled me with a very specific, complicated pride, watching someone I loved build something genuinely impressive, in an industry that had, for most of its history, run almost entirely on the accumulated instinct of people like me. AeroPredict's weather gate is conservative, Des, she told me, the week the system reached full deployment across all 41 turbines. It won't clear a climb recommendation above 18 knots sustained ground level wind, full stop. That's a wider safety margin than most of the farm's technicians were actually observing before the system existed. Ground level wind isn't the wind that matters, Adiz. You know that as well as I do. It's the wind 300 feet up that decides whether a climb's safe, and there are entire weather patterns out here where the two numbers don't agree with each other at all. I want to be fair to what AeroPredict actually got right, because this isn't a story about a badly built system. Its ground-level weather gate genuinely was more conservative than informal practice had been before its installation, and across 4 years of operation, it had measurably reduced climbs attempted in marginal ground conditions that technicians, under production pressure, had sometimes pushed through in the years before automated scheduling existed at all. Adiz had built her career on exactly this kind of careful, defensible engineering, and I want that clearly on the record before I describe the gap in it, because the gap wasn't carelessness. What it didn't have, and what nobody building it had fully understood the necessity of, was any way to measure the specific atmospheric condition that decides whether ground wind and nacelle wind agree with each other on a given afternoon. I remember the specific evening she first walked me through AeroPredict's full architecture, spreading printouts across our kitchen table the way she'd done with every major project across her career, watching her explain confidence intervals and sensor fusion logic with the same patient enthusiasm she'd once used to explain her thesis research, years before either of us had any reason to think our marriage would eventually include arguing about wind physics over dinner. I need to explain the specific physics this story turns on, because it's the actual center of everything that happened, and because it's exactly the kind of narrow, technical detail and optimization system built primarily around ground-level sensor data and production targets was never designed to individually account for. I've tried to explain this pattern to people who've never climbed a turbine, and I've never found language that fully captures what it feels like to stand on solid ground in near total calm, knowing with absolute certainty that 300 feet above you, the wind is trying to tear something apart. Under most weather conditions, wind speed increases gradually and predictably with height, a relationship AeroPredict's models handled well, extrapolating nacelle height conditions from ground sensors with reasonable accuracy across the overwhelming majority of the farm's operating days. Under a specific, less common atmospheric condition, a low-level jet stream forming during particular temperature inversion patterns common to this region in early autumn, that relationship broke down entirely. Ground-level wind could sit at a calm, climb-friendly 12 knots while nacelle height wind, 300 feet up, ran nearly 40 knots in sustained gusts, an atmospheric decoupling I'd personally learned to recognize across 2 decades, watching specific cloud formations and the particular stillness of tall grass at ground level that, paradoxically, often meant something considerably less still was happening far above it. AeroPredict had no sensor data from Nacelle Height except during active turbine operation, when the blades themselves generated usable readings. During a stopped, lightning-damaged turbine awaiting inspection, exactly the scenario this story turns on, the system had nothing but ground-level extrapolation to work from, a genuine, structural blind spot that 4 years of otherwise excellent operational data hadn't yet surfaced, because low-level jet conditions strong enough to matter occurred, by my own informal count across 9 years, perhaps 4 or 5 times a season, rarely enough that the pattern hadn't yet forced its way into anyone's engineering priorities. I'd raised this specific gap with Adiz 18 months before this story's events, after a near miss involving a younger technician who'd aborted a climb midway up the tower when he felt exactly the wind discrepancy I'm describing, an incident that generated an internal safety report but not, in the end, a change to AeroPredict's WeatherGate logic, because the system's own logged ground-level readings that day had technically stayed within its approved climbing parameters throughout. I remember sitting across from Adiz in her office after that incident, both of us frustrated in different directions, her needing quantifiable data to justify an engineering change and me having nothing but a shaken technician's account and my own 2 decades of pattern recognition to offer her. The system cleared that climb correctly by its own data, Des. I understand your technician felt something the sensors didn't capture, and I believe him. But I can't retrain a WeatherGate around a felt sensation without measurable data behind it. What would you actually want me to build differently? I want a Nacelle Height anemometer that reports even when the turbines stopped, Adiz. Ground sensors alone will keep missing this exact pattern until the day they finally don't. That's a capital request, not a software fix. I'll put it in front of the board for next year's budget cycle. I can't manufacture new hardware out of an argument alone. The afternoon this story turns on was the 2nd week of October, a lightning strike hitting turbine 23 during an overnight storm, damaging a blade tip sensor and triggering an automatic shutdown that AeroPredict flagged for priority inspection the following morning. The turbine's continued downtime costing the farm's operator a contractual penalty under a power purchase agreement that specified maximum allowable outage duration for storm-related damage. I'd heard the storm roll through overnight myself, lying awake beside Adiz listening to thunder that felt, even from inside our house, considerably closer than the 10 miles separating us from the nearest turbine row. Ground conditions that morning read a steady 14 knots, comfortably within AeroPredict's climbing threshold, and the system generated an immediate priority climb recommendation for turbine 23, factoring the contractual penalty clock directly into its scheduling weight, a detail that pushed the recommendation to the top of that day's queue ahead of several lower urgency maintenance items. I was at the site office that morning, reviewing the day's climb schedule, when I saw turbine 23's recommendation and felt a very specific, familiar unease looking at the sky toward the northwest, where a particular high, thin cloud formation was moving faster than the ground-level conditions would have suggested. Exactly the visual signature I'd learned to associate with the low-level jet pattern 18 months of near misses and informal observation had taught me to watch for. I stood at that window longer than I probably needed to, coffee going cold in my hand, running through the same mental checklist I'd run through perhaps a dozen times before across 9 years on this site. Adiz called the site that same morning, aware of the contractual penalty pressure and pushing, in her role overseeing operations, for the climb to proceed on schedule. The penalty clock on turbine 23 is running at $4,000 a day past the contractual window, Des. AeroPredict's cleared the climb. Ground winds 14 knots, well within parameters. What's actually holding this up? Look at the cloud movement out the north window, Adiz. That's not 14-knot weather up high, whatever the ground sensor's reading. I've seen this exact pattern 4 times in 9 years, and every single time, nacelle winds run 30 knots or more above what the ground was showing. I can't override a contractual penalty clock based on cloud shapes, Des. I need something more concrete than that if you're going to hold this climb. I hung up the phone and stood there a moment longer, watching Marcus load gear into the site truck through the window, a young man with 11 months on the job and no particular reason yet to trust an old safety coordinator's read on a sky that, by every instrument reading available to either of us, looked entirely climbable. I thought about the technician 18 months earlier who'd aborted his own climb partway up, describing afterward a specific wrongness in how the tower moved beneath him that no ground sensor had captured. I thought about how close that morning had come to a very different outcome, and how little of that near miss had survived, in the end, as anything more than an internal report nobody had fully acted on. Adiz wasn't wrong that I had no hard number to put in front of her, and I wasn't wrong that 26 years of climbing towers had taught me things no sensor array had yet learned to measure. The genuine difficulty of that morning was that both of those things were true at once, and somebody still had to decide what to do about turbine 23 before the penalty clock, or the weather, made the decision for us. I want to describe what I actually did next, because it fell partly within my formal safety authority and partly, honestly, outside the specific protocol the site normally followed. As site safety coordinator, I held unilateral authority to hold any climb I personally assessed as unsafe, regardless of AeroPredict's clearance, authority written into the site's safety charter specifically to preserve exactly this kind of human override. What I didn't have was any instrument data to back my assessment beyond 26 years of pattern recognition and a cloud formation. Adiz, working from a laptop 40 miles away, couldn't see for herself. I drove out to Turbine 23 myself, along with a young technician named Marcus who'd been scheduled for the climb, and rather than sending him up immediately, I launched the site's inspection drone to fly a vertical wind profile up the tower's height before committing anyone to the actual climb, a procedure that added roughly 20 minutes to the morning schedule and that I'd used perhaps a dozen times across 9 years, specifically on mornings that felt exactly like this one. Marcus stood beside me at the base of the tower while the drone climbed, harness already buckled, watching my face more than the sky, and I remember him asking, half joking, whether I did this before every climb or just the ones that worried me. I told him the truth, that it was only ever the ones that worried me, and that the whole point of the drone was to find out, in 20 minutes, whether a worry was worth having or whether I'd simply spent too many years up in weather that had never quite forgiven me for it. He laughed at that, still more curious than nervous, the particular kind of untroubled confidence I remembered having myself once, before a mentor twice my age had first shown me exactly what a low-level jet could do to a technician who trusted ground instruments over his own gut. The drone's onboard anemometer, climbing slowly alongside the tower, confirmed what I'd suspected watching that cloud formation from the site office window. Wind speed held a calm 13 knots up to roughly 150 feet, and then, within a 30-foot vertical band, jumped to sustained gusts over 38 knots, holding at that elevated speed for the remainder of the climb to Nacelle Height, precisely the atmospheric decoupling I'd been describing for 18 months without hard data to fully prove it. I held the climb, radioed the drone data directly to Adiz, and watched Marcus's face shift from mild frustration at the delay to something considerably more sober once he understood exactly what that wind profile would have meant for him, 300 feet up a tower with nothing but a safety harness and a climbing line between himself and precisely the kind of sustained gust that has ended other technicians' careers, and in rarer cases, their lives, at other wind farms across the industry. Adiz drove out to the site herself that afternoon, an hour after I'd sent her the drone's wind profile data, and I want to describe the conversation honestly, because it wasn't simple vindication for either of us, even with hard data finally sitting in front of both our eyes. She'd left a board meeting early to make the drive, still in her work blazer, dust from the site's gravel lot already settling on her shoes by the time she reached where Marcus and I were standing beside the drone's landing pad. 38 knots at Nacelle Height, 13 at ground level. That's not a marginal discrepancy, Des. That's a completely different weather system up there than what any of our sensors were telling us existed. I've been describing that exact gap for 18 months, Adiz. I didn't have the drone data to prove it until this morning, because I only pulled the drone out on mornings I specifically suspected this pattern. Most days, I never bothered, because ground and nacelle wind actually do agree with each other the vast majority of the time. Which is exactly why the system never flagged it as a priority gap. It's rare enough that 4 years of otherwise clean operational data buried it. I need you to understand that I wasn't dismissing your concern out of stubbornness. I genuinely didn't have anything concrete enough to act on until this afternoon. I know that, Adiz. I'm not angry at you for needing data before changing a system that's protected a lot of climbs correctly for 4 years. I'm telling you the one time it mattered, the gap between what the ground sensor said and what was actually happening at height would have put Marcus in serious danger, and neither the system nor either of us would have known until it was already too late to matter. Marcus stood a few feet away through most of that exchange, quiet, watching the two of us work through something that clearly went back further than that single morning, and I remember catching his eye at one point and seeing, in his expression, the same sober recognition I'd felt myself the first time an older technician had shown me exactly how close this exact pattern had once come to costing someone their life, years before either of us had any reason to think it would eventually be him. Standing at the base of that tower. 18 months, Des. You've been telling me this for 18 months, and I kept asking you for a number, because a number is the only thing I can actually put in front of an engineering review board and a budget committee, and every time, you had a feeling and a cloud and a technician story instead. Adiz's voice caught slightly on that last part, less anger now than something closer to the specific exhaustion of realizing how much had been riding on a gap neither of us had known how to close any faster than we had. I need you to know I wasn't choosing the penalty clock over Marcus's safety this morning. I genuinely believed the system was right, because it had been right, for years running, on every other morning like this one. I know you weren't choosing the clock over him, Adiz. I've never once thought that about you, not this morning and not 18 months ago. What I've been trying to tell you the whole time is that the system doesn't know what it doesn't know, and neither, honestly, did I, until this drone finally gave both of us the same number to look at. I reached for her hand, dust from the gravel lot still on her shoes, and felt something in her shoulders ease slightly, the particular release of an argument that had finally run out of places left to hide. We're not on opposite sides of this, we never were. We're just the two people this exact gap happened to land on hardest. She looked past me at Turbine 23 for a long moment, its stopped blades motionless against a sky that, 300 feet up, was still doing exactly what the drone had measured half an hour earlier, and I watched her run the same calculation I imagined she'd been running since the moment my radio call reached her, the specific engineer's math of how many other mornings, across 4 years and 41 turbines, might have carried the same invisible gap without anyone happening to fly a drone up to check. Neither of us fully resolved, in that conversation, the deeper tension underneath it, the genuine difficulty of building safety protocols around a rare pattern that resists easy quantification until someone happens to be looking for it at exactly the right moment. What we built together over the following months, working with the board and the equipment manufacturer both, was funding for permanent Nacelle Height anemometers across all 41 turbines, instruments that report continuously regardless of whether the turbine itself is operating, closing the exact blind spot that had let 4 years of otherwise excellent data miss a pattern rare enough to hide in plain sight. Turbine 23's blade sensor was repaired 6 days later, once conditions cleared, the contractual penalty ultimately negotiated down through a force majeure weather clause that Adiz's team successfully argued for using the drone's own wind profile data as documented evidence, turning what could have been a straightforward financial loss into, instead, the specific piece of evidence that finally justified the capital investment I'd been requesting for 18 months. I still fly a drone wind profile before any climb on mornings that carry even a hint of that particular high, fast-moving cloud pattern, though the new permanent anemometers have made that specific ritual considerably less necessary than it used to be. Marcus asked me, a few weeks after that October morning, to teach him what exactly I'd been watching for in the sky that day, and I've since made a point of walking every new technician at the site through the same visual pattern recognition, the same way an older technician once walked me through it, decades ago, on a different wind farm entirely, long before any of this technology existed to make it look, for a while, like nobody would need to notice clouds at all anymore. Adiz and I talk about AeroPredict's ongoing refinement most evenings now, over dinner, the same way we've talked shop for years, except the conversation carries a specific new weight neither of us fully had before that October morning. She told me, once, that the hardest part of the whole episode wasn't the engineering fix at all. It was sitting with how confidently the system's 4 years of clean data had let her believe a rare gap simply wasn't worth prioritizing, right up until a drone flight her own husband insisted on finally made that gap impossible to keep deferring. Wind at ground level still lies about wind 300 feet up, on the specific mornings it matters most. What I've learned, watching a system built by someone I love get this one thing wrong for 4 years before finally getting it right, is that the rarest risks are often exactly the ones a good system, optimizing against everything it knows how to measure, will keep missing longest, simply because rare things are, by definition, hard to see enough of to fully believe in. It took a cloud formation, a drone flight, and a marriage built on enough trust to argue honestly across a kitchen table, to finally close a gap that 4 years of otherwise excellent engineering had never quite found its way to on its own.